Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraud, bringing you Capitalism Hits Home, a show about the interpenetration of personal life with political, economic, and social life. I don't really believe that anything can be separated out as a determinant of everything else. Everything shapes everything else. Today, I want to talk about family, because family has been a social institution, an economic institution, and a personal institution. Family has been the basic source of child rearing and of emotional support for people. However, families are in trouble, and that doesn't work. The whole premise of family, and by the way, this is a very taboo topic, to question family, even though it has to be questioned. But the very basis of the idea of family doesn't make sense. Just because you get pregnant, however accidentally, doesn't mean that you're capable of the 24-hour care of an utterly vulnerable little life. That's crazy. Now people say, no, it's maternal instinct. Well, that's not so. There was a study shown that said most women, when their child is handed to them, think, oh no, what do I do with this? Because human beings might have some instincts, like to avoid danger or whatever, but we are overwhelmingly social creatures. Our brains are formed through our interactions with society. Children who were abandoned and raised by wolves, because there were those, Hansel and Gretel wasn't kidding. It used to be that when someone remarried, the kids would be taken to the woods and disappeared if they were from a former marriage. And some of them were raised by wolves, and they learned how to behave like wolves. They never learned to talk. They were captured at the age of 12 or so. There's a very good film and book called The Wild Child of Aveyron, because this child was captured in France. But they never learned to act like humans, because social learning makes us who we are. Now, we do interact as a biological species with the environment and with the other influences, but we are primarily social creatures. And to ask somebody, just because they got pregnant, to have the full responsibility for another life makes no sense at all. In the United States now, where you were born is terribly, and I say terribly quite advisedly, terribly influential. If you're born into a poor family, you're probably going to be those 1 in 5 American children who doesn't have enough to eat and doesn't have healthy food choices. Fresh fruit and vegetables and grains are more expensive than canned and packaged foods. Also, the air you breathe won't be as healthy. The projects are always built by highways, in case you didn't notice, and most often near incinerators and other dangerous things that wealthy neighborhoods keep out of their neighborhoods through the lawyers they hire and the connections they have. And so that your very physical existence can be compromised. It's also more likely that you'll get inferior child care. The average cost of child care, of infant care in the United States, is $11,000 a year. And since the mean salary is about $36,000 a year now for an individual, and a lot of children live, 42% live with single mothers, you are not going to get quality care. You'll get cobbled together care with whoever will watch you, and unreliable care so your mother can work. And unreliable care means that in the crucial years of brain formation, 0 to 2, you'll be parked in front of televisions in a wet diaper. So that when we talk about family, we're talking about the most gross inequality and privation. People say that the family form that we have, the nuclear family, is an eternal and natural unit. Well, it's not. Before the 1800s, the family was the feudal family because feudalism was the basic mode of protection. A group of serfs were tied to the land. The lord of the manor ruled over them, and they gave tribute from the land that they tilled. They gave a certain portion of whatever they produced to the lord of the manor and kept enough to survive and be able to have children, reproduce more serfs. That began to stop in the 1800s, when instead of benefiting from a whole lot of small farmers, the lords of the manor in France and England and elsewhere wanted to enrich themselves with herds that took big swatches of land, and that was not going to work with all these little farmers, and so they threw them off the land. This, by the way, has been very carefully documented in a difficult-to-read book called Policing the Family by Jacques Donzelot. I have it right here. He writes in truly turgid academic prose, but it's worth getting through. At any rate, what happened is that under feudalism, the feudal family, which consisted of the lord of the manor at the top, and then the father of the family, and the eldest son ruling over everyone else, deciding what land they had, whether they could marry, and all the other big decisions of their lives. Well, when the feudal landlords, in order to enrich themselves further, threw the serfs off the land, they formed little towns and later cities and found whatever work they could. But once the feudal father wasn't around to make decisions for them, and once their local Catholic Church in France wasn't there to enforce their morality, people just had sex with whoever they wanted to. Pregnant women were abandoned. Kids were left in the street. And it wasn't working out well. This was especially true after the French Revolution, when feudalism was destroyed and the feudal family no longer had a hold on people. And so they migrated to cities and towns where they could eke out a living somehow. One of the biggest demands of the French Revolution, which is not widely publicized for obvious reasons, was that the state should take responsibility for the family. Well, after the revolution, the richest people that were left in France, the aristocracy that hadn't been killed, the remnants of the church, which had been a huge feudal landlord, those who still had their land and weren't killed, and the new tradesmen and bourgeoisie that was growing up in the towns, the new capitalists who were hiring these serfs at low wages, of course, to make more money. They were the only ones with money. And they had meetings which are corroborated by Jacques Donzelot in France. That work hasn't been done in other countries, and I've looked. But in France, they thought, oh my God, these people want state support for children. Who's going to pay for that? We're the only ones with the money. Something has to be done about that. And so they instituted what we have now and what we call, quote, natural. The individual feudal family, where the father's the head of the manor and he's given that authority. The mother is protected in pregnancy, and the children are chattel, half slaves that you can rent out and make money off of. That way, also, men were much less likely to go on strike if their wives and kids would be starving. And they wouldn't give jobs to anyone who wasn't in that kind of a personal configuration. And people, in order to survive, formed nuclear families. So it was started as a tax dodge, and males were given primacy over females and children. And the adults in the family were given total control of the children. And really, that control lasted a long time. It wasn't until the 60s that you couldn't kill your kid, bring your dead kid to the emergency room and say he fell downstairs or something. No one looked into it until the 1962, when the child battery syndrome was publicized. And by 1967, laws were in place that injured children, people who injured children were responsible, and that doctors had to report suspicious injuries, and so did hospitals. So that's fairly recent, 1967. At any rate, the nuclear family is a recent invention, recent in human history. There have been all sorts of configurations for bringing up the young. Now, that family form is collapsing. It used to depend on women's unpaid labor in the home to raise children as a kind of gender task. But now that women are in the labor force en masse, and now that men can't support dependent wives and children because capitalists move their lucrative jobs overseas, and now that children are having such a hard time, children are America's poorest people. The second poorest people are mothers, and motherhood is a predictor of poverty because we don't have the supports for children that would take the burden off individual mothers and parents. Now, you can say that's really wrong. Families are really nurturing. Well, in many cases they are. However, 86% of child homicides are at the hands of their parents or relatives. You can't pick up the newspaper in New York without reading about some parents who starved their kid to death or beaten their kid to death. And the absolute power of whoever gave birth to this helpless infant is a bizarre and irrational thing. Child abuse is the greatest of children under 1 year old, who can't escape, who are helpless, and who are often very annoying, Children don't even recognize you until about 5 or 6 months. That's why diaper ads never show newborns who don't even recognize their parents. So it's not all that personally gratifying to take care of a dependent child. And those who are most likely to be abused are the children of single young mothers living alone with no support. Child abuse goes way down at age 6 because kids have to be away from home for about 6 hours a day. They also can run if a parent gets to be too murderous. However, somehow, in order to keep from paying the taxes The right wing keeps emphasizing the sanctity of the nuclear family. Under Reagan, it passed that there would be universal Head Start, childcare for children, free and quality, starting at 4 years old. But it was nixed by the right wing, who pressured Reagan, saying the sanctity of the family didn't allow that. They are the ones who are always saying that the family is the most important institution for raising children, even when they know it's a disaster, but they're saving money for the rich who would need to contribute to public child care and after-school care and summer care, which they have in other countries. France probably has the racial mix closest to the United States. They have free universal education for children, starting at 3 years old and going on. If you get into college, that's free too. They also have after-school programs and summer programs, which can't be any more than 15% of your salary for the months that your kid is in a summer program, and they're good summer programs. They have swimming, they have athletics, they go to museums, they go on trips. The same thing is true for the after-school programs, where they go to athletic fields, where they get free coaching, free lessons. The United States is very backward around this. Now, what is the alternative to the family? Well, there aren't well-established alternatives because it's really hushed up that families are failing and that children are in trouble. There have been, however, some very successful experiments, which are mainly hidden. For example, after World War I, followed by the Civil War in Russia, there were tens of thousands of orphaned children who formed predatory gangs in order to live. And it was a real problem for the new Russian government. And so an educator called Anton S. Makarenko, an educational hero in Russia, started what were called children's colonies, which were run by children and run for children, that took care of tens of thousands of orphans. When a child arrived at one of the centers, they were met by a brass band of the children who were in the center. They were given a uniform, their old clothes were burned, and they were given in a ceremony, and they were given uniforms made by the factories at the children's colony. The older ones, and as soon as they were able, the younger ones, kept the place going. They did all the work. They even laid a railroad track and bought a locomotive to take the goods they produced to sale. There's a beautiful movie that commemorates this called The Road to Life, and there's a 3-volume book called The Road to Life about the formation of those colonies and their extraordinary success. Also, World War II produced a whole bunch of orphans. And the UN Refugee Association took a very strong hand. They set up children's homes where children were cared for, where there was a 1-to-5 ratio between little children and consistent caregivers. And then, when those children got to be older, they were sent to be adopted, and they were not disturbed children. They prospered. You don't need a mother home alone to raise children. You need 5 consistent adults to attend to children, and if they're babies, to pick them up, to hold them, and to talk to them, and to relate to them. Also, homes were set up in England for orphans, where children lived together. And these were mainly children who were taken out of concentration camps, where they survived, even though their parents were killed. However, the mental health of those children was as good as any in England. There's a book called The Rage to Live that talks about this. These books are hard to find because alternatives to the family are really repressed, and questioning of the family is repressed. It's only beginning now in 2 books, one by Emmy O'Brien called Abolishing the Family, and another by Selma James called Abolish the Family. But those are 2023 books. They're very recent. There's also a wonderful experiment that still goes on, a wonderful alternative to the nuclear family that is a feature of Russian life. It's called Kitezh, Kitezh. And what it is, it's a whole community of alternative houses close together, of couples who raise 4 or 5 children at a time, and sometimes have their own children, in these individual houses, although they all have dinner together, and they all have activities together, and education together. And if a child doesn't like the house that he, she, or they are in, they can change houses. They have a choice, which none of us do usually in our families, that we can't say, gee, I don't like living with you two, I'm going to try someplace else. My friend has a nicer place to live. No. But in Kitezh, that's possible. And everyone who works there, from the gardeners to the cooks to the cleaners and, of course, the educators, is committed to the welfare of the children. It's a whole community committed to the children. And the children who go there are children whose parents are so terrible that the state has had to take over, or children who've been abandoned completely, and so the state has to take over. And these are alternatives to think about, because the family has failed. Most couples who get married end in separation or divorce. 50% of first marriages, 70% of second and third marriages end in separation or divorce that's legal. And then there's about 15 to 20% of people who don't have children to fight over and don't have assets to fight over. So they just make an agreement and split. So you're talking about the majority. These homes are not stable for children, and they're not stable for adults. We have to rethink the family, because it's obvious. Just because you get knocked up doesn't mean you're a fit parent. And yet, this has been going on for a long time, and it can change. And as radicals who look at the well-being of people, who look at the economic and social and personal lives of people, we have to question the nuclear family, which started as a tax dodge and is really in trouble now. Thank you. Goodbye for now.